Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. Such a pleasure to have you back again as we continue to explore Reb Chaim Kanievsky's Seforim. There's so much been written, been said about Reb Chaim, and it's hard to really fathom what Reb Chaim was. I think that's the bottom line. But this has been a unique experience to dive into Reb Chaim's Seforim and see the vast topics that he wrote about and the Seforim that he used. Been, at least for me, been very, very entertaining is the wrong word, but it's geschmack. Very enjoyable for many people, including myself. I'm not sure I should continue this minig, but why not? We got a couple of very, very complimentary messages, so I'll share it with the audience because some self-promotion is always a good thing, right? Hi, Rabbi Eliezer. I've been enjoying tremendously the series of shiurim you have been giving on Old Daf, on Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and all other topics. I would like to thank you for that, and I hope these shiurim can continue. We hope so as well. Somebody else wrote, the Reb Chaim Seforim review series is amazing. It's riveting and insightful and gives me chizuk. I look forward with great anticipation for new parts to come out. When I receive the email that a new part has been released, I drop all that I'm doing and listen to it. Thank you for all that you are doing. Okay, so with that exciting introduction, Rabbi Eliezer, how are you today?
Baruch Hashem, Baruch Hashem.
Okay, so today we're going to discuss small kuntris. You'll tell us if it's small or large, but a kuntris which is found in Siach HaSadeh, all about memory. And Rabbi Eliezer, tell us what it's called and give us some brief background about what you're going to be talking about today.
Okay, so Amir Hashem, what you hope to talk about is it's called Kuntris Sefer Zikaron. And as Reb Chaim Kanievsky writes in the first page where he talks at length about what the Sefer is about, he's going to talk about Dvarim HaToivim L'Zikaron and Dvarim that are Hakasha L'Shicha, which means it's not good. It will help you. It causes you to forget your learning. B'divrei Chazal, V'kol HaShayich L'zeh. Now, the question that everyone has been asking and still asking and will continue to ask about Reb Chaim Kanievsky is how did he become who he was? How did he recall everything? There's so many crazy stories of his unbelievable Bekias. I believe he wrote the blueprint years ago. He wrote the Sefer, the date that he concluded the Sefer, like many other Seforim, he writes the date. He wrote it L'Zecher Nishmas, his mother. He concludes it. She died Erev Chodesh Nisan Tavshin Lamed Gimel. Around then is when he completed this Sefer. So this Sefer, going through the Sefer, is a blueprint in understanding Reb Chaim Kanievsky. And I'll explain what I mean as I go through, as I discuss in Mirz Hashem what we hope to discuss. But basically, he lists out, just very briefly, is that what he's going to discuss things that we find that people always hear about, things he shouldn't eat, that might cause you to forget. What's this Isser? Is it an Isser Deraisa? Is it Isser Rabbanan? Women? What about children? And he goes through specific foods that people should eat, or people know about, such as olives. How could you eat it? And many other examples. And he goes through them piece by piece. But the first part of the Sefer, which is why I call it the blueprint, is how one should, what one could do to retain one's learning. And there he will discuss what he does. But that's briefly the Sefer that we're going to discuss today.
So you feel that Reb Chaim gives some secrets? When I say secrets, it's understandable that Reb Chaim's Asmada, it starts with Asmada. You got to learn and learn and learn and learn and learn and learn. You feel this Sefer gives some of the secrets to having memory that Reb Chaim himself used?
Definitely. I mean, it's not so complicated. It's not such a chiddush because all these things are from Chazal, as he's madgish in the first line of this chibur. He says Dvar Matayvim Amvorim B'divrei Chazal. It's not collections of things that he found in whacked out Seforim or rare Seforim. These are Chazals, and then he goes and illustrates where they are. So Mirz Hashem will see that.
So he's not going to be bringing down schools and things that people could do. You have to work. That's the bottom line, right?
Correct. That is what it's clear will come out from this. That you got to learn. You can't do a bunch of different things, and those things will help. You'll learn. You got to learn. Yes, correct, 100%.
Okay, so take it away.
Okay, so first I'm going to give three very short introductions, b'chlal, about this topic to give us some background of this particular sefer, and then we'll move right away into the sefer. So first, number one is like this. The when one learns in Chazal, we find a major dagesh on memory, and it's very simple. Torah Sheba'al Peh was not written down in the times of Chazal, and eventually, whatever was, even what it was, that's its own discussion. But so memory was very important. There's a Mishnah novice everyone knows called Shecher Davar Echad Mitalmudai Ba'ila V'Akasav Kilu Mischayev B'Nafshay. Very powerful words. The Gemara Menachet Tzadik Tes Hamabeis says if someone forgets, he's over belav shenam yishamar lecha v'yishamar nafshecha ma'oi pen tishkach es advarim. Throughout Chazal, and we find different techniques to how to remember things. According to some Rishonim, it's its own discussion, a big machlekes, but asmachtos are just psukim to help one remember various halachos of Chazal. Not everyone agrees with that, but Simanim, everyone, we just finished Pesach, everyone, the most famous simon, the Tzachadash B'Achav and Agol Shal Pesach, according to some, is to help to remember basic things. And we find throughout Gemaras all different types of simanim that today they've been forgotten, but there's all different types of eitzes in the Gemara, how to remember, what things to eat, and different actions that one does that helps one remember. Now, throughout the generations, even after Chazal, Seforim are written on this topic like everything else. Just to mention a beautiful small sefer from Rabbi Yehuda Ari Mudina called Lev Aryeh. It was in recent years it was reprinted by Mechon Shuvi Nafshi. It's a very nice sefer on the topic. There is a famous sefer from a Rabbi learner called Shmiras Hagufa Nefesh. Very, very popular sefer on all different yanim of schoolis, but also about an yanim of memory. And this sefer was printed numerous times, over 10 times, I believe. With numerous additions each time. Another sefer in recent years was a sefer called Zecher Isa, and there's constantly all chiburim coming out on this type of topic. It's a topic that people like to write about. Now that's part one. Part two is why do we find? This is just to fine tune a little bit more the what I just said. Is why do we find such an emphasis in memory? Why is there such a concern of memory? And the answer is that even as late as in the times of the Rishonim, we don't think about it as much because we take everything for granted. We have computers, we have Seforim, but they did not have, even when Chazal was, when Torah Sheba'al Peh was allowed to be written, doesn't mean in the times of Chazal that they sat down and wrote Mishnayos and that everyone had Mishnayos in front of them and you could go into a local Seforim store at the time and get a Mishnah, or even further on. Let's say in the times of Ga'inim, Rishonim, did they sit and learn in yeshiva in front of Seforim? And the answer is, interestingly enough, pretty much no, they didn't. Memory was extremely important. Books were a fortune. Whatever books means is obviously a manuscript form, but it was a fortune. So most people did not have in their libraries Seforim. Torah Sheba'al Peh remained Torah Sheba'al Peh until around the printing age. What I mean, of course, it's possible in the Middle Ages to see it. One could see, but it was something that was not so common. So therefore, we find, and you'll see tons, not only in Chazal, even much later on, things that you didn't do and that did were because of memory. And with that, those are two introductions that I would like to mention, just to give us some little bit of background. I'll elaborate on them possibly as we go on.
Okay, fascinating. Those introductions and the Seforim that you mentioned about memory. And it's true, we don't think about this. When Rashi was writing Rashi, on Shas, do most people have Shas in front of them? The answer is no.
Correct. That's the point that yes.
So besides for the practical aspect of people having to memorize, like you just said, related to their learning, are there certain practices or minhagim that were instituted maybe back then that we still do today that maybe we don't actually focus on them as memory tools, but we do them anyway?
So yes, there definitely is. There's a bunch. But one of them, just to illustrate with one example, a lot of times an example is helpful, is we know Matzah Shabbos, many people, they sing these mirrors, special mirrors. And some of these mirrors have a focus on Eliyahu Navi. And some people have a minhag to say Eliyahu Navi many times. All these are different minhagim beyond the scope of this. But what this is brought down in numerous Rishonim, Machzor Vitri, Sefer Gematria Zebila Chassid, the Reikeach, and minhagi Ashkenaz Seforim such as the Maril, Trumas Hadesh, Rabbi Isaac Tirna. And many reasons are given. There's many aspects to the minhag. But the Tur writes at the end of Simon Reish Tzadik Tes. Yesh Hagen Leimer B'chol Matzah Shabbos Kol HaPsukim Shemuskar B'Hem Eliyahu V'Omer Shu Toiv L'Shikcha V'Yidrachav Mutzlachim B'chol HaShavua. So to the Sefer Yuchsim brings down that he heard Me Abba Moiri Shekim Me Chacham Hazakenim Zichron Levracha Shemoyel L'Shikcha V'Sheyoymer Oisam Shiva Pamim. That's on something else, and then he says V'Shez Zagula Yesh La Kimoy B'Sechiras Eliyahu B'Matzah Shabbos. And so to the Levush in his Sefer says Noigen Leimer B'Chol Matzah Shabbos Psukim Shemuskar B'Hem Eliyahu V'Omer Shish Kabal B'Yadim Shu Toiv L'Shikcha. So we see there could be multiple other reasons behind this saying these mirrors, but one aspect is that there's some type of skula that it helps for one's memory throughout the week, one's learning. Okay. Al-Kopanim, that is just one example of, we could give many more, but we have Rachmanis.
You want to give any more? Forget about the Rachmanis. Any more you want to talk about?
It could be one, some will come up throughout this.
Okay, so you have to keep on listening. You can't stop now. Okay, fine. In the previous episode, you've talked about various Seforim that Reb Chaim used to write the Sefer. Maybe talk about some of those Seforim that he used, those unique Seforim that he used.
Okay, so first, I already mentioned there's some Seforim written about memory. So Reb Chaim Kanievsky, when he sets out to write the Sefer, and he gives his Hagdama about it, which we'll get to momentarily, he says, what did I use? He says, he has a sefer called Shmir Sanefesh V'Shmir Malya, and the Hagoyis Sham, and then he has the famous Tamim and Hagim, Umasif El Kol HaMachnos, which is interesting that he quotes also because this was like today it's more accessible, but in the 70s it was a pretty rare sefer to have, which is it's similar to a Darkei Tshuva type style. On Yeridea, so someone attempted to do an in-depth collection of all the literature on Orach Chaim. He didn't get too far, but it was also from the Munkacher library. Now, what Orach Chaim mentions, and this is, where does this topic begin from? This topic, what we're calling, is collecting all the materials about Inyanim of Zechira. So Orach Chaim says he had a sefer called Shmiras HaNefesh V'Shmir Malya. So this sefer it's first printed in the 1870s under the name Shomer Yisrael. Printed a few times, and the author was a very chashuv person, Rav Meir Orbach. He was a prolific writer. Rabbi Yisrael Matisyo Orbach. I apologize. Now, this Rabbi Orbach wrote a bunch of svarim, and they were actually used by the Mishnah Berurah in writing his Mishnah Berurah. Sometimes he quotes them. Now, one of the svarim that he wrote was this sefer. Originally, the name was actually a different name. It was called Shomer Yisrael. I guess at some point he switched it to Shmiras HaNefesh. One of the early editions already has Askama Chashiv from the Shalom Eshiv with Hagais, and it's printed a bunch of times. As already as 1911, a much more expanded version of the Sefer comes out from Rav Shapsi Lipschitz with numerous Isafis. This is called Shmir Ma'alya, the Parish Shmir Ma'alya, and this is what Reb Chaim Kanievsky had, and it takes the sugya to a whole. It collects the information out there and is mafalpul in the different pieces of information about it. And I'm going to give momentarily a specific example so we could see and appreciate everything from about what's called in this, what's part of this topic, and what Reb Chaim Kanievsky does to the topic also. But this sefer becomes very accepted, as I quoted. Rabbi Lerner wrote the sefer Shmir Zagov HaNefesh, so this sefer is, of Reb Chaim Kanievsky sefer Zikaron is quoted extensively. And L'mashal, when one learns the Gemaras that relate to the topics of memory, which we're going to get to in Hirius, so one opens up an art scroll in Hebrew, in English, or the Eis V'Hadar Masifta, you'll find that it's all, that basically that's the source, is the Sefer Zikaron of Reb Chaim Kanievsky. Basically, he takes a topic that, now, the Shmir Ma'alya and Shmir HaNefesh, they collected from multiple sources, and they, what's called Sgulus. Not only Varam that linked to Zechira, they just would link in just to understand the illustrated stuff relating to names, such as Savas Rabbi Dar Chassid, and all types of schools from all types of schools. Varam. Reb Chaim Kanievsky's sefer is not about that. He's focusing on specifically things from memory and what Mekairis that are found in Chazal and Rishonim. Now, we see from here, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, again, is Reb Chaim Kanievsky, it was so significant for him. As we know, Reb Chaim Kanievsky was so into remembering his learning and chazering. Why it was so important? Because Torah was so important. So he obviously wanted that one should have an oifen, how to retain all the Torah that one learns, and that's part. It's not about the schools, although there actually is svarim about the schools of Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and that's its own discussion. But this is specifically things found in Chazal and Rishayim. Now, why does he write the Sefer? So as I mentioned already a bunch of times, Reb Chaim Kanievsky spells this out for us in his introduction. He has a nice introduction on the topic, and in the introduction he says he brings down the Gemara that he brings down an interesting medrash, which says that Hashem Yisbarach made in the bria that you forget, because otherwise people wouldn't learn. If you remember everything you did after if you learned it, you wouldn't have any motive to chazer or learn again. So it's built into the human being that one forgets. Anyway, so the question is, and I mentioned already the Gemara and the Mishnayos about it: is it an isser? Is it a serious isser? Is it an isser deraisa or is it isser derabbanan? So Reb Chaim Kanievsky here says that one's supposed to do what one can do. He says mitzvah l'shtadel b'chol koichai, that you should not forget your learning, but he's not. And then he goes and says, what should one do? Okay, so that's what the first part of the Sefer is. It has 28 pieces, and he says what to do, how to remember what's going to be good for your memory. What's the examples? So first is davening, and he brings Gemaras and other Chazals, that the Koyach of Tefillah, your Anava and Midas. Then he has a piece called Miyotainig. He brings from a Gemara. If the two are involved in Gashmias, it's going to affect your memory of learning Torah. Then, of course, Chazara. And he has a whole long piece on Makairis about that, saying it Laitzi Bepeh, to say it out loud, understanding. And he has a few other tips that he mentions learning from a Sefer. And one, which we'll obviously discuss a little bit more later on, was making memory, Lasei Siman and memory devices. A famous one is eating pashachris. Already brought down halacha and others. Okay, and this is the first part of the sefer, and each one he'll say a sentence haragel b'pashachris. So sometimes he'll bring you a gemara, and sometimes he'll say ha'ara, and that's the first part of the sefer. It's about 3-4 pages. Okay. Now, but that up till now, these are ways how to remember. But what about doing things that might make me forget? What is that? So that's the second section, and that's most of this sefer, which is not all that big. It's about 13 pages, the sefer. And then between all the Haisafas and Meluim, you probably, if it was reprinted today, which I imagine it will be printed properly in the next near future by the family, it'll probably end up being something closer to 20 pages if it continues in this small print. But the way things go today, they'll probably turn into a whole massive sefer with more marmakaimis and bigger print, because this is small print. Anyway, so Chelik Beis of the sefer is mostly about areas that if you do these things, you're going to forget. What are these things? So and what is the sources for these things that what one does? So as I said, Reb Chaim Kanievsky emphasized already in the beginning of the sefer, Gemaras. Okay, one such Gemara is found in the Hayrius Yud Gimel Amud Beis. It's a famous Gemara. It says, if you do these 5 things, you forget your learning. It says, what's those things? Eating achbar, or something that a chatul ate from, or you eat a leaf of an animal, or if you eat, then it says a lashon of haragel b'zeisim, you're ruggled to eat zeisim, olives. Then it has a few more things, and then it says you sleep and you have your clothes as your pillow. Okay. Then the Gemara continues and has some other things that help retain your learning. One of them is a famous, which we'll get to, is haragel b'shem and zayis. Okay. And then the Gemara continues, has different things, and it says, if ha'over ben shnei nashim v'ha'isha iveres ben shnei anashim, this is also ha'mistakel b'fnei meis, ha'koyre ksav shal gabe ha'kever, reading the tombstone, and there's other things in the Gemara mentioned. So, but Kitzur, it's a Gemara. So what does one do when you learn a Gemara? You want to know if it's halach l'maisa. So you automatically, we're spoiled. We look on the side of our Gemara, and we look at the various tools that are found on a regular Gemara, and we try to find if it's where it is in the Torah, in Shulchan Aruch, Rambam, and you'll find that you always look for the little letter, and there's no indication to see where this Gemara is brought down la halacha. One looks in Shulchan Aruch, It's not in Shulchan Aruch. So what's going on? You have a Gemara that says you do these things, you're going to forget your learning, and it's not brought down in halacha. So already, so that obviously is why. So Reb Chaim Kanievsky already begins in his introduction about this second section, and he talks about this, and he brings down that there's the Gemara that I started with, the Menachos, that says if you forget your learning, you're even the lav of Ishamer Lecha. So maybe if I go ahead and I eat things that cause me forgetting, is it a lav deraisa? So he comes out. Reb Chaim Kanievsky himself concludes based on the Sefer Hasidim that it's not a iser deraisa, and he says it's not even a iser derabanan, and he says and one of his rayas is what I just said. That we find, so we see it's not such a isser. They don't bring it down lahalacha. Okay, so what's pshat in the Gemara Menachos? That's its own discussion. But he says, however, he goes ahead and writes a whole kuntrus of another 10 pages. So what's he doing? So he says, and he says why, and we'll get to why in a second. Similar to his conclusion, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has a similar conclusion, and they bring down a Halicha Shloima. He also says about all these things, the Gemara, and he says, Kol Eila Dvarim Ein Bam Iser Medina El Mishum Zehirus. Okay, but Rabbi Lerner, who I told you in the Shmir Sagaf Hanefesh, he brings down multiple sources that seem to argue, but this is Reb Chaim Kanievsky's psak and Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach about what this is the background for what we're about to see. Okay, now Masechtas Hairius, one opens up the Meiri, and the Meiri also does not sound like it's Mamasha Isser Dairais or even Isser Rabbanan, but he has it's a beautiful piece. Kedai very much to learn, but basically one should go out of his way to do things, to eat things, and watch what he does to preserve his learning. But it's more like it's a taiva or a medical zach, which would go into perhaps medical eitzes that we find in Gemara, this is definitely not the only place we have such a thing. Okay. So where does it come from that any of these things, let's say even the things mentioned in this Gemara in Hairius, is even brought down to halacha? So we have in 1692 a chibur comes out which changes the face of the world of halacha till today, the Bhaganathram. The Bhaganathram brings down in at least 3 places different pieces that are based on these Gemaras in Hairius, and he brings them down from Arizals. Now, one of them is, which also is an extension of these Gemaras, is we're putting on getting dressed, putting on 2 articles of clothes at once. So it's already a Bhaganathram in Siman Beis. If Cotton Gimel brings down a Rizal and Sefer Kavanis, which also relates to this. Wiping one's hands on one's clothes, which is also a Tajbitz Katan. Talmud and Rami Ruttenberg. Bhaganathram brings this down in Kuf Nun Ches. And there's a Bhaganathram which is talking about Zeisim, which we'll get to. So Chaim Kanievsky already in his Hagdama says one should Lemaisa, he says, because we find, and then he points out these 3 Bhaganathrams, so we see you should be nizar in them. Interestingly enough, he says from here we see women. What about women? But they don't have to, because already he proved from this piece in Sefer Hasidim that the Sefer Hasidim shows it's based on his learning of the Sefer Hasidim that it's not even a derais, not a derabanan. So for women, they don't have to be nizar in these inyanim, but and a katan certainly doesn't. Okay, fine. And people do argue, but as I said, this is Reb Chaim Kanievsky's approach, and this is Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's approach. Now, what about the third makar in the Bhaganathram? What Reb Chaim already points to is Siman Kuf Ayin, Sif Katan Yud Tes. So there, the Bhaganathram brings down a piece from the Arizal which says about dvarim that make one forget. Kigoin Zeisim Ukiyayitz Behen. Says the Bhaganathram, Ein Ze'el Ba'am Haaretz. It's only for Am Haaretz. Avla Oichlin B'Kavana Kenoida Ma'isifin Lo Zechira Ki U'Mesaken Oisai. Because somehow eating, if you eat olives and you have the right kavanas, it helps the memory even more. What's the makar for the Bhaganathram? He says Ksavim. So now, what is the makar when the Bhaganathram says Ksavim? The makar is the Sefer Kavanas, which is already printed, and I believe in Shin Pei. And this was the Sefer that the Bhaganathram had when he was bringing down the Arizal for halacha, it was the Sefer Kavanas. It's not like how the let's say, for example, the Mechon Yerushalayim edition of the Shulchan Aruch with the Bhaganathram, they bring down the Makar for this Arizal is something else, and that is not the Makar for the Bhaganathram. Every time he says Ksavim, he's referring to the Kavanas, and there was another work of the Arizal that he had, which was which was called Shulchan Aruch Arizal. We don't know who did it, but someone pieced together different materials of Arizal. The Shulchan Aruch Arizal also talks about this aspect and has a similar nusach about it, and there's differences in all the nuschais, but there's beyond the scope of what we're talking about now.
Since I discussed before shameless promotion, I want to take this opportunity. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer can tell us in 1 second. Bhaganathram is something special for Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. I believe the doctor in your name has to do with the Bhaganathram.
Yes, it does. Baruch Hashem, I was zeicha to spend many years learning some of the Bhaganathram, and and I've written some stuff about it. But that's just, I have Rachmanis. Okay, now...
That's why you take the liberty to argue on Mechon Yerushalayim. That's where it comes from.
Yeah, but yeah, okay, yeah, definitely. Anyway, it's interesting is this particular Arizal, so the Aruch HaShulchan brings it down from the Magen Avraham, but the Mishnah Berurah does not. So we see already the whole person that I'm saying that's bringing down the Arizal that talks about Zaysim, and even the Arizal who doesn't come out with Zaysim, that it's going to be Asatid Zaysim, because according to the Arizal, it's really just for Amaratzim, whatever the Amaretz of the Arizal. Maybe that could be, at least myself, I still probably am an Amaretz of an Arizal, I would imagine. But what is pshat that the Mishnah Berurah doesn't bring down this, and he does bring down some of the others that Chaim Kanievsky brings down. Now, in general, it's very interesting over here as we see something about the Arizal, because the Gemara doesn't say anything about that. The Amar doesn't make a differentiation between Amaretz and a regular person. It says Haragil, Haragil. What's the lashon? Bezesim. It doesn't say anything that Amaretz, doesn't say anything about Kavanah. So you see here the Arizal. Okay, fine. Something that the Arizal is adding to the sugya. Okay, but I'm not coming to be to go amkos into all the pratim of every aspect with the Arizal. There's a lot to say in general and in this sugya and all the different lashonis of how the different pieces of the Arizal brought down. One piece I will say soon, but for the most part, it's not for now. Now, okay. So now, anyway, the point is that this Magen Avraham, this is the start of how this thing, how this topic of eating olives even gets into the world of halacha, so to speak. Because already, as I point out from the Gemara, there's no Rishonim really that mention as an Isser or something like that. And as I said, I wanted to bring an interesting raya. Chaim Kanievsky mamish held that this is not halacha l'maisa and it's only sort of eitzah. And the raya is like this. Chaim Kanievsky, and I'm going to elaborate this on in future shiurim, I hope, is that Chaim Kanievsky was a crazy makbid that he's not writing svarim halacha l'maisa. And he writes this in numerous svarim. I believe I mentioned this by the grasshopper sefer. He says such a lashon, and by tattoos he says it, and he says it in his Shaina halachas and Derech Hamuna he says it all over. That even though he's writing halacha that works, it's not halacha l'maisa. By this sefer Zikaron, he doesn't write this anywhere. He doesn't say big letters. Don't rely on me halacha l'maisa. Why not? The answer is because he holds, and that's what he writes in this introduction. It's not Issa Deraisa, it's not Issa Derabanan even. It's an Inyan Nachal Yizar Lechatchila. So therefore, this sefer he could, even though L'Shitase he never would do such a thing for if it was real halacha, but this sefer he doesn't have to make such a disclaimer and post it all over the sefer, which he does elsewhere. Okay, I'll call upon him that just throw it out there. Fine. Okay, now. So now we led up to with this Magen Avraham and everything. So what's the later discussion? And here, the point of this is to bring out Chaim Kanievsky, what he brings to the table also about eating olives. So up till now, if we're frozen in 1692, we have an Arizal brought down by the Magen Avraham. Fine. So comes along Chaim Kanievsky in this section of the Sefer, and he says Haragel B'Zeisim, and he brings you down a Gemara Hayrius that we just mentioned. He brings you down a Rabbeinu Bechai about it. He brings down this Magen Avraham. He brings down okay. Then he says like this: what the Gemara says, Ragil. So what does this mean? Let's say someone only eats it lefrakim, and obviously we're handling what does this mean. So he says like this: he brings down from a Gemara in Brachas, a Gemara in Yavamis, a Yerushalmi in Brachas, and a Yerushalmi in another place that they ate olives. And he says there's other places. So therefore, as long as you're not ragil, you're allowed to eat olives. Okay, so this is Reb Chaim Kanievsky using his tremendous bekias, which we've elaborated on numerous times already. He says like that. But the problem is, what is ragel? So he says, what does ragel mean? He brings you a raya based on a Gemara in Brachas, that it means once in 30 days. So therefore, Yoiser milamed yoim, loy matzim de mikri ragel. That's his conclusion for the thing. So someone wants to eat every few months olives, you could, according to this. Now, what's interesting is the Ben Ish Chai says, when he's specifically talking about our Gemara of Ragel over here, he says it's doing something 3 times. But what is the 3 times? When? Is it in a month? Is it in a lifetime? It's very vague. So Chaim Kanievsky, his Hagdara is a little better. It's not a little better, it's much better, and it's based on a Gemara and Brachos. So we see already, point number 1 is Chaim Kanievsky bringing to the table with his tremendous bekias that they ate olives. Sveitens, not only they eat olives, what does it mean? What in the Gemara? Back to the Gemara that says that if you can eat olives, it's problematic. Says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, rugel. That what's rugel that you would not get into the problem. What's rugel? And then if you don't do rugel, then you'll be okay. Fine. Continuing on, Reb Chaim Kanievsky talks about is he brings down Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden in his Hagayis over here, in the Gemara in Hirius, and also Mark Tzia, both quoted by Rabbi Yaakov Emden, says, what about if one eats, there's 2 types of olives. There's olives that are raw, and then olives that are not. Many olives that we have, they're pickled olives or something of the sort. So what will be the din with that? So he says the Gemara is talking about if you eat raw olives, but if they're pickled, that's not going to be a problem. Okay, so he brings down this Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and he says, look in the Meiri. So I already quoted earlier the Meiri. He says if you look in the Meiri, he says that if it's salted, it's going to be a problem, not like Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Okay, but the problem is, I said is that when you learn the Meiri, it's not pasha if the Meiri is talking halacha l'maisa or not, or it's more like it's a taiva that Chazal has for you. Okay, then he brings down that they would eat olives. So it's not enough that they ate olives. He shows that they ate olives that were pickled. From where he uses his vast bekias in Trumas and a rash over there, and another place in Trumas. Then he has a problem based on Yerushalmi in Brachas, and Bekitzer again here we have Reb Chaim Kanievsky dealing with this Rabbi Yaakov Emden based on his incredible bekias and seeing the Rishonim on the topic. Okay, great. Now, then he goes on, and he says that he refers you back to the Sefer Shmiras HaNefesh, which I mentioned at the outset, that this Sefer is what he had. So the Shmiras HaNefesh, so first, the Shmiras HaNefesh he brings down our Gemara in Hirius, based on a different nusach from the Chuppah Eliyahu, which is found in the Reishis Chachma. Okay, then, later on, he says the Shmiras HaNefesh brings down a ragel b'zeisim kashel shikha that you're gonna forget your learning. Okay, so then I said there's a shmir malya. So this pirish shmir malya brings down a whole discussion of Mar Makaimis about eating similar to what we just discussed from Yaakov Emden and other geshmaka makairis about the topic. Now later on, this sefer was printed with different hagais. So one of the hagais was from one of the chashuv dayanim in Yerushalayim. Was a Rabbi Yisrael Valitz, a Hungarian Paisik, and he writes in his Hagais on this Shmiras HaNefesh, he says, in Yerushalayim they ate, they were makbid. What's going on? So he says what they did was, because if you look further in the Gemara, it says if someone goes ahead and eats olive oil, that helps. So just have to make sure what's the medicine when you're eating olives, make sure to have it with olive oil. And that will help you not have a problem. So says that's one eitzah, and he says, and that was the minig. I believe he says that was the minig. That was the minig that people did in Yerushalayim. Says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, it says that if one eats olive oil, it's going to help your memory. But who said what's the right combination? And who said every person's the same? So just because how do you know how much olive oil is going to battle and how many olives? So how many olives are you going to eat, and how much olive oil do you have to battle it that it's going to be a problem? So Chaim Kanievsky says he doesn't like that Eitzah. Okay, now here's where it gets a drop more interesting. So first, I mentioned earlier Rabbi Yehuda Medina. So he writes already in his sefer. He just throws out an interesting piece of information. This doesn't help us, but as much. But he says, I remember until I was 13, I ate daily bread with shemen zayis, and when I was young, my memory was incredible. This is what he writes. Okay, so we see, not that we need any rayas for Chazal, but he said he tested it and it worked. Okay. But okay, so now we have some interesting tidbits about this particular story. When I mentioned already in the first time, and more than once, I've quoted the Sefer Seforim put out by one of his grandchildren of Reb Chaim Kanievsky, all about the Seforim of Reb Chaim Kanievsky. So he talks about this Sefer. So he says, Reb Chaim Kanievsky wrote this Sefer, and he says that and he brings an interesting nusach for the feedback that he got when he wrote this Sefer. What does he say? He says like this. He says, he brings down the Rabbi Yaakov Emden and everything fine. He says that someone met Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and when he came, and he said that he had tinus because beforehand, the Kitzer, after Chaim Kanievsky came out with the Sefer, he didn't have what to eat with his bread daily because he can't have shemen zayis. That's the story in here. He was complaining to Chaim Kanievsky's wife. That's the story in this Sefer. Okay. Now, so there's one of the many Seforim out there that deal with the Stipler and has many pieces of information from Chaim Kanievsky. Is a famous Sefer, Archas Rabbeinu. Archas Rabbeinu was a brother-in-law of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he was very close Talmud both with the Chazon Ish and with the Stipler for many years, and he wrote down many things about the Stipler that he heard. Anyway, he talks about what about the Stipler and eating olives, based on this Gemara, and about this Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and that we mentioned, and basically it sounds like the Stipler was makbid. Okay, so too it sounds like he brings down that Chazon Ish was also makbid, and that this eitzah of pouring shemen zayis is not good. Then he says that the Stipler told his wife, "Don't buy olives." Okay. Then he says, Reb Chaim Kanievsky himself said he ate, as long as it wasn't in 30 days, Reb Chaim Kanievsky himself would eat olives. And then he said, what about Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach? He says, when Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach got the Sefer, he says, you messed up my breakfast. Okay, similar to what we just said. But he says, what was his minig? The minig was like the minig of Yerushalayim, similar to what I quoted from Revalitz, that they would eat shemen zayis together. Okay, so this is how the Archas Rabbeinu, and Archas Rabbeinu is a reliable source, not only for the Stipler and Chaim Kanievsky and the Chazon Ish, he's also a brother-in-law of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Okay, another person brings down a version of the story with Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he says, what about eating? He says this that Reb Chaim Kanievsky says, that who said you're going to know how much to combine the how much olive oil goes against olives. Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach didn't go for it so much. He says it's a very big chiddush. Who says it needs to be exact? Who said you need to weigh up and have it exact? This is not. This is in Yoni Skuli. This is not Tully in real things. So so it's good enough if you ate olives and you counter it with what the Gemara says immediately afterwards. You don't have to have. There's no measurement that's going to be necessary to come and that's going to help. So that's Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. This is brought down by a Talmud of Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who are a beautiful sefer of all different types of material of conversations he had with Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach called Madani Shloima, Yechmiel Fried from Dallas, Texas. And so he has a whole piece about this that he spoke to Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And the Halicha Shloima also in Tefillah, page Chaf Gimel, they have this that Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach held that the Minig Yerushalayim is fine. So it's interesting over here. They both these stories don't say what Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach himself was naig. That basically Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was machmir, and this fits with what we know about Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, which is that even though he was a paisik and he would be makel for many people, himself he would be he will be much more machmir. He actually tried to hide what he would be noyig himself, and here we see the Darchas Rabbeinu is bringing down Rosh Hashanah was fatainet, so to speak, with Chaim Kanievsky. After you say, you messed up my breakfast. But for people, he held that they definitely have what to rely on if you eat at the same time the olives and the olive oil. Okay, but the point I'm trying to bring is, even though this sounds like such a okay, as I said, here you see Chaim Kanievsky, and you see how he uses his knowledge, even on something small, a Gemara that it's not even brought down la halacha so much, how he goes about it. Okay, but I'd just like to one last point in the sugya of olives, and then we'll move on. Is as follows: Is there new material about this? So, like everything, Baruch Hashem, we have new material about this topic. What I mean is that the new discoveries are made. So a few years ago, there was an incredible discovery. We found a magic sefer, yes, a magic sefer of Reb Chaim Vital. This is its own discussion, many hours to discuss, but we're not going to now. And in this sefer is different inyanim of Kabbalah from Reb Chaim Vital. And it's an authentic sefer in his handwriting. And here we have, when he talks about olives, so first he has a piece where he says he saw people that ate Zeisim Harbe. They caused them they forgot everything. They were very forgetful. Okay, so that fits in line with what we know. Then he says a few pages later, he talks by Arichos how to soak your olives, that it should be different methods, mamish, how to make your olives, and then you'll be able to eat it. How to soak it for a few months. So here we see similar to what Rabbi Yaakov Emden said. And the Rabbi Yaakov Emden's sack will be found even Rabbi Chaim Vital, who were saying from the Arizal and everything, and you don't need to use what the Arizal said if you have the right kavanas, which that we don't know what those kavanas are. We're not mukubalim, but if it's soaked, say it's pickled olives, then you have from this Reb Chaim Vital, like Rabbi Yaakov Emden, saying his Agoyis on Gemara and his Mark Tzia. Okay, Ad Kan, this is the story of the olives, and this is Reb Chaim Kanievsky's take on the olives for now. Okay.
Wow. Okay, so should everybody go to the refrigerators and get rid of their olives, their olive cream cheese, and their olive whatever they use for their breakfast? Okay, everyone make their own decisions based on where they're holding in life. That's what Eliezer Brot would say. And we're not going to judge you, right?
Exactly.
We're not going to judge you if you're a good person or a bad person. Anyway, okay. Is that it for foods? Or you want to talk about anything else?
Yeah, so we're just going to give one other example, which we mentioned in the Gemara from Hirius. It says, "Isha iveres ben shnei anashim." Okay, so this is a Gemara. And again, here Chaim Kanievsky has some material about it. I'm just going to focus on one tiny piece. He says, "V'shamati al marana chazanish," that he was very makbid on this particular thing, not to walk between women or have women walk. Okay, now the shaila is what about a katana? He says, so Chaim Kanievsky writes, maybe a katana is not. You don't have to be makbid. She's not an isha. Okay, now just to throw out one tidbit about this is that here Chaim Kanievsky doesn't say that he saw. He says Shamati al Marana Chazanish. So so the Chazanish, as we know, there's so much material about the Anhagas of the Chazanish, and Chaim Kanievsky was the person that his father already writes about in Archas Rabbeinu, that he was the person that we rely on for many of the things, but he didn't see everything but the Chazanish. So there was interesting is that there was a writer, a Yiddish writer, who before he went off the derech, he learned with the Chazanish Bechavrusa for a few years, and he was very famous. His name was Chaim Grada, and Chaim Grada wrote a novel, and in the novel, one of the characters, so to speak, of his novel, which is all based on true information, is a lot of the story is, but all the facts that he talks about specifically about the Chazanish is all true. And there's a passage there in this book. It's called the Yeshiva. He said he's referring to when he saw the Chazanish coming to visit. So then they saw that basically it seems like there was some women outside the Beis Medrash. The Chazanish was about to walk into the Beis Medrash, and they couldn't understand why the rabbi wasn't going into the Beis Medrash. So he chapped right away that the Chazanish wouldn't pass between the women. So he went outside. So he would be shoulder to shoulder with the Chazon Ish, and then he would have no problems passing the women. Anyway, this is Stami idea, but it was known the Chazon Ish was very makbid, and we have Chaim Kanievsky. You don't need to come on to Chaim Grada. I'm just throwing that out there for another source about it. Okay. Anyway, that's only one other aspect, but as Chaim Kanievsky goes through, he has a total of 37 Makairis that are based on Be'ikr, Gemaras, Chazal, and Paiskim about Kashal Shikha. Okay.
So that women, Reb Chaim also writes that that's not la halacha. I mean, we're not passing over here, but that's also minig.
So it's a Gemara. Again, it's a Gemara, and based on Chaim Kanievsky, it's a lechatchila you should be makbid. He says this particular one, the Chazon Ish was very makbid about, and that's all. More than that, you got to ask your local rabbi.
No, without polling people, I would think, just, I don't know, from being around, it seems like people are more makbid on that one than on olives.
Right, could be correct.
Okay, so you mentioned some of the Seforim that Reb Chaim, a couple of Seforim before that Reb Chaim used to build off this Sefer HaZikaron. In the previous episodes, you mentioned not just Seforim that he built off, but certain other Seforim that he would bring in that were interesting. How he even tied them in. Any interesting Seforim that he brings in ties in specifically to the Sefer?
Yeah. So one, he's looking for anhagas of people that were noyig these different things that they actually did this. So one source that he brings more than once is a Sefer called Leked Yosher. Leked Yosher is a collection of Makairis from a Talmud of the Trumas Hadeshin. So what's so interesting about this? So just very, very briefly, he quotes it over here at least twice. Once there's in a different sefer I found that he had Rebbe Yashiv come down because of something he saw in the Leked Yosher. It was a sefer that he was very familiar with. Now the sefer, what is the sefer? The sefer is a Talmud that was learned by and lived by the Trumas Hadeshin, one of the most important sources of the Ramah. So this Talmud would record everything he saw by his Rebbe. The Sefer remained in manuscript for hundreds of years, and only in 1903 does it come out. Earlier pieces were quoted in the 1870s by Avram Berliner, but not really. Until 1903, then the Sefer comes out called Leked Yosher. It's on Inyanim of Ar Chaim here. It's fascinating amount of material. Here we have the Trumas Hadeshin, tons of material that we don't have in his Trumas Hadeshin, and we see what he did, all types of things. So Chaim Kanievsky used it also. Now, like everything else, one point or another, someone's going to get grump about it. So yes, a very chashuv Talmud Chacham in Bnei Brak, Rabbi Chil Zilber said that there's some very strange things in here. He doesn't want to rely on it. Okay. Then there was another big bucky, Yehuda Leib ben David. He also went with a similar. He also found things in here to be that he didn't like. Okay, but there was a very chashuv paisik. His name was Rabbi Shmuel Monk, and he has many Chuvas Seforim called Pasadecha, full of interesting things. He writes that there's nothing wrong with the Sefer. We could see Nicker Mitoch Svarv, that even if he wasn't a Paisik, but he was medayik very carefully, and he was Meshamish his Rebbe, and what he wrote is true. It's not a Ziyuf, and there's no problems with the Sefer, and he held that you could rely on this particular Sefer.
Who was this Shmuel Monk? Where was he from, and when? Which
he was also someone that a Yekish Paisik, and he lived in Haifa. And he's a worthy person to talk about at great length. He wrote a bunch of Svarim Pasadech. He's quoted a lot of times in contemporary Svarim. He died probably 25 years ago, something like that. And anyway, the Leked Yosher, so we see here Chaim Kanievsky using it a few times. And just to mention, Mechon Yerushalayim recently put it out based on, they have an autographed Ksav of the Mechaber, because the original one was not based on the autograph, it was based on someone copied, whatever. But anyway, it's available today in your local bookstore. It's a very useful sefer, a very enjoyable sefer to read. Here you see the Anhagas. Today we're very common. We buy, people like to buy the Anhagas of different Gedolim, such as I mentioned, Archas Rabbeinu of the Stipler. It's 5 volumes, everything the Stipler did. Here we have the Trumas Hadeshin, one of the main paiskim that the Ramah relied on in creating his work on Shulchan Aruch. We have, okay. Adkan, one interesting sefer just to throw out there.
Okay. Anything else? Anything else you want to talk about before we wrap this up?
Yeah. So I would like to conclude with one piece. We'll try to make it as brief as possible. I have Rachmanis on everyone at this point, and that is like this. As I said, Chaim Kanievsky, besides for quoting Chazals, he quotes for this sugya something called Brisa de Maisa Torah. And this Brisa de Maisa Torah, so it sounds, what's this Brisa de Maisa Torah? So it has a different name also. Sometimes it's called Pirkei Rabbeinu HaKadosh. So they're very interesting. It's a very interesting chibur. Very unclear what it is, but it seems the Gra was very fascinated with this chibur, and not only that, the Gra added material. Rav Raman Agra writes that my father added a lot of material to the Maisa Torah, whatever the Maisa Torah is, and then I even added to that. Okay, when they found this Ksav Yad, they this Xavier with the Vilna Gaons had guys to this. They didn't know what it was. They sent letters to the Shalom Meshiv. There's stories. There's other. It seemed to be a very strange chibur, and they couldn't get to the bottom of what it is. Now, besides Reb Chaim Kanievsky in this sefer, our memory used it, and he used it in many other svarim. In I mentioned already more than once that there's these fascinating letters between him and Reb Dov Landau called Sich Davar. It was printed mamish very recently. And in here also, there's a bunch of letters between them that they handle this Bryce of the Maisa Torah of Dov Landau and Reb Chaim Kanievsky. Leave it up to them to handle the pieces about this Bryce of the Maisa Torah. So not only the Vilna Gaon, we have Reb Chaim Kanievsky being into. So Reb Chaim Kanievsky uses it also over here. So what is this chibur? So the answer is this chibur. You open it up. It's Alpi the Aleph base, and you'll find it goes according to. It'll bring down. Let's find the piece. Eis Beis, Shnei Parnasim Taivim Amdul Yisrael Moshe v'David. Where is this a Gemara? Then it'll bring down. It goes according to letter. It'll go things that are in the letter that are associated with two in Chazal. Shnei Dvarim Torah u'Beis Hamikdash. Nega Beis Dvarim Gehenim v'Galus. Where is this from? A Mechilta. And let me just give one more example. Shtei midos hayu b'mikdash. What are they? There's two midos, and it's a Gemara Menachos. Beis mitzvah shenizgalu tamon lo yarba lo nashim v'lo yarba susim. Where is this a Gemara in Sanhedrin? So you look at this and you're like, what's the significance about this? Basically, it goes through the Aleph base, and it has all different memras taken from Gemara and Chazal, api numbers. Okay, say that. So first, one thing is, and this is what Reb Chaim Kanievsky is using, and this is what the Vilna Gaon is using, sometimes it could be a different girsa in something brought down over here. Rishayim had this chibur, and this is why Reb Chaim Kanievsky is using it for the topic, because there is some differences in the girsayis of Al Gemara and Hayrius in this chibur, and Reb Chaim Kanievsky points out of 6 or 7 in this chibur, and this is why it's also important for the Vilna Gaon. But as I said, the Shalom Meshiv brings down. And they said Rabbi Akiva Eiger, when he looked at this, he couldn't understand what's behind this chibur. So I already mentioned earlier that the memory that we mentioned, there's something called simanim, and there is different, let's say that's Achadash B'Achav, different ways how to remember. So what fascinated the Gra, and so to Reb Chaim Kanievsky in my eyes, is that this, a lot of times in order to remember information, a good way to remember it is with numbers. As I said, Reb Chaim Kanievsky brings down simanim. So this is the Vilna Gaon with Chazer Shas Keseder, with tons of material. In he would try to put it into ways how to remember. So therefore, he created, and we have these lists: Klalim and Hilchos Brachas, Klalim and Hilchos Tayers, Klalim and Hilchos Tumah, the Malachim based of Karbanis. He would have all types of lists. And this Bryce and Maisa Torah, which is early on, was Alpi the Seder Aleph base, different collections of numbers. So sometimes it could be a Shina Nusach in it, but other times it's just simple, easy way to retain crazy amounts of information. Not only was the Vilna Gaon into this type of thing, I mentioned in the past, the Vilna Gaon had a tremendous Talmud. Reb Zalman Mivalazhin, the Toldos Adam, has a whole parak Barichos that Rabbi Cheskel Feivel has a whole parak in the Sefer Toldos Adam. That Reb Zalman Mivalazhin also was into these type of things to help memorize and remember tons of information in Chazal. There's a lot to say about it. We won't go into this Barichos, but just to say two points about this, that it's not only that Reb Zevin Lamashal writes this, that the Gra was like this, that the Gra was into this type of thing. There's a famous story. One time, Rabbi Yisrael Shklover in Pasach Shulchan brings down that there was a person that said to the Vilna Gaon, he knows Masech the Sukkah, he wants to get tested. Okay, the Kitzer, he asks him a question, and he says like this, it's a famous thing. He says, how many machlokes are there in the Masechta between Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda, Reb Akiva, Reb Tarfon, Rabba, Reb Yehuda, Abaya, Rava, v'chulu v'chulu. He starts listing them out. um, and he starts going through in order all the different sukkahs that are kosher in the Masechta, and this is how he would retain he would retain lots of information. Is he would ask and he would say, how do you, he would ask, and this is how he tested this person, was specifically, he would say, how many machlokes are there in this Masechta, which is very similar to how what I'm seeing in this Bryce and the Maisa Torah, how many dinim you learn about, how many sukkahs psulas are there, and how many sukkahs ksheris are there, and how they're learned. Okay, now, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, similarly, we now have tests. They've been printed in a few different places. Reb Chaim Kanievsky, different tests that Reb Chaim Kanievsky gave to kids when they would come, or groups of Talmidei Chachamim. And these tests, a lot, interestingly enough, one of the questions that he would ask in a Masechta would be, at the end of the Masechta, he would say, let's say you're learning Klayim. So he'd say, tell me, in Klayim, where Brachas, Peyah, Shviyas, Trumas, and the list goes on and on and on, where all these halachas come up in the Masechta. Then afterwards he says, and then tell me how Gid Anasha comes up in Klayim. And then he ends off how Megillus Esther comes up in Klayim. Then he has, Lamashal, in a test on Demai, it ends off, he goes, similar type of thing. How does Lemon come in? Yerushamai and Brachas, Rav Haigoin, how does he come in? And now we do have that. Baruch Hashem, we have the answers. They printed the answers in a few different places, but the same idea. Reb Chaim Kanievsky, another place that we have. Reb Chaim Kanievsky his father used to teach him a song. Echad mi yedei, echad ani yedei. What would he say? Echad hachayfer bar siach amar babakama daf nunam beis. Shnayim ma'iksim metalis. He had a song using numbers to help remember and retain tons of information. This is something that it's not only I'm saying that the Vilna Gaon was into, and with this test that we saw that he gave him Masechta Sukkah and his fascination with the Bryce and the Maisa Torah. This also we see with people. Reb Chaim Kanievsky was very into it, and Bechlal into this type of thing. This is a way how one could remember information. To conclude, when everyone makes a siyum, and Chaim Kanievsky is legendary for making a siyum, he would end his siyum with, we talk about the names of we list out the various sons of Rav Papa. So what's interesting is, there's a tshuva of Rav Haigoin. What's the reason behind this? He says, because it helps one remember. One just finished the Masechta, so you need to remember. This is a skula to help one remember, saying the names of Bnei Rav Papa. So Chaim Kanievsky brings this down in a sefer. Okay, and there's other Makairos that say that this is what it is. Chaim Kanievsky, and this we conclude, has in one of his Seforim over here in the Siach, the back of the Siach Asoda, he has a kuntris where he talks about these Bnei Rav Papa. So everyone knows it says Asaris Bnei Rav Papa, right? Chaim Kanievsky has a list with it's crazy how many. Again, obviously it's not one Rav Papa, he says, but numerous children of Rav Papa that are mentioned in Sifrei Chazal, Rishonim. I mean, you just look at it and you're like, oh, this is Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Obviously, he was Makayim. What he lived by this. He chazered. He didn't just eat olives or not eat olives. That wasn't the point. He sat and learned. He chazered everything. He made simonim to remember, to retain his information, and this is one of the keys of how someone. Why I said it all the way in the beginning, the blueprint, why this sefer, I see in it Reb Chaim Kanievsky. So here we see what I keep on saying, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and I'm linking him to different people. Here we see the connection with the Vilna Gaon. This is a similar Nakuda by the Vilna Gaon also. Chazara, Benali Chazara help coming up with eitzes. And it's not only for Chaim Kanievsky did it for him, he had different ways. Every person should come up with eitzes, how to retain and remember information. I'll conclude with the following story. This is not a story that just happened hundreds of years ago. It just relates to all this. I was fascinated when I heard it. And the story is like this. There's a book. It's called Moonwalking with Einstein. And basically, there's something till today. It's called Olympics. It's called a memory Olympics. So you'll ask, what in the world is that? The answer is like this. There's ways how to remember information, large amounts of information. As I said, it used to be that they didn't have Seforim, they didn't write, even in the non-Jewish world. So they used to come up with methods how to remember information, such as in the Sefer from Yudai Medina and numerous other ways. This is this Bryce of the Maisa Torah that I'm saying, that there was ways how to retain information. So there was a guy a few years ago, and he heard that there's something they have in Olympics where people remember tons of information. And there's an Olympics to see who can remember challenges live, tons of information. Who can remember more? And then every year is a champion for this thing, and they obviously practice to do it. So you would think that it's people that they're born with photographic memories and stuff like this. Okay, so this guy was looking to write a book. He was a writer, and he heard about this concept. So he went down and he interviews the guy who won. He watches this Olympics. He sees this guy remember crazy amounts of information, and basically he tells the guy, "How did you do it?" So he goes, "You know something? You're a regular. You have a good memory." The guy goes, "No, I don't have a good memory." So he tells this author. He says, "Next year you could be the champion." He goes, "Are you crazy? I have an awful memory." And he goes and teaches him the techniques. This happens a few years ago. You can look it up on Google. Moonwalking with Einstein, I believe it's called. And basically, he Taka becomes the champion. There's memory devices, how to remember tons of information. This is going on the world at large before the printing press. This is how they have to do it. And okay, so for us, every person's kedai, different ways how to remember, take it, and this way one could be zaycha to remember at least a little bit that they learned, and to conclude, when you learn, it's brought down, and I think Chaim Kanievsky says it somewhere also, but if you write down and you take notes and everything, you'll be zaycha, you're able to take that up, at least the shamayim, when you get your big faher on what you learned. Anyway, Adkan, I have Rahmanis on everyone. Adkan for today.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And of course, I have to mention Rabbi Avram Goldhar, together with Barry Leibowitz, who have created this fantastic program called Zuchur, where there are literally hundreds of Daf Yomi learners specifically now who are memorizing 3 points in every single daf. They've gone through hundreds and hundreds of dafim, and they have thousands by now. And these guys, regular people, they use simanim. They use interesting sentences, and people draw pictures and different things like that. And Ashrei Chelkam, that they really have a good zikaron by putting in literally a few minutes a day. Besides the fact that when you have a memory, besides remembering it, you can become a bigger masmid, right? Because when you're doing whatever at any given time, without holding a sefer open in front of your face, you could be chazering different things in your mind and keep your mind occupied, which is a good thing. So, thank you very much. Looking forward to the next edition of Reb Chaim's Seforim Explored. I know you mentioned to me that you want to talk about the Shaina Halachas and Derech Emunah, and Reb Chaim has many more Seforim that we could talk about. So looking forward. Have a wonderful day.